Hey everyone, it's Simone Watson, and this is part 3 of my series on classifying your manuscript. So today we are going to talk about the types of speculative fiction. Yay! Doesn't everyone love speculative fiction? Okay, so what is speculative fiction? Speculative fiction is fiction that does not take place in the real world. Specifically, we have fantasy, sci-fi, horror, and magical realism. And then there are some things that go between those things. For example, science fantasy. Okay. Um, so so when you talk about speculative fiction or spec fic, I think I only call it spec fic because I'm a nerd. I don't think that most people call it spec fic. But when you talk about that, one huge element is going to be something that we mentioned in the first like 2 segments, and has its own video. Can you guess it? It's called suspension of disbelief. Suspension of disbelief. That is a huge factor in classifying your speculative fiction manuscript. Okay, there's just they all have suspension of disbelief on some level, and it's on the world level. It's on the world building level, and so setting and suspension of disbelief are the two things that really make these genres what they are, that make them speculative. So what is fantasy? Fantasy is fiction that takes place in a magical world. Um, this can, there are so many types of fantasy, like so many. There's like historical fantasy, there's contemporary fantasy. A lot of times you will hear those two things, but it could be neither. Contemporary fantasy has to do with like being kind of like the real world, like it's based on the present time, but it's fantastical. And this is confusing to some people because of the difference between contemporary fantasy and magical realism, which I'll get to in just a second. But yeah, you have historical fantasy, you have contemporary fantasy, which is based on the present time. You have epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is like the Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, things that are like epic fantasy is like very, I don't want to say it's very, very fantasy because that doesn't really make sense, but the world that is created is so complex and it's so different from the real world, and there are like so many factors. It's just a very well developed world, and it's very much its own world. Epic fantasy, you would also call that high fantasy. High fantasy is really the main term for that. Epic fantasy may more have to do with it being a journey and it being like this epic feeling story, but etc. So you have high fantasy. Within that, there are just so many. There's sword and sorcery fantasy. There's just like a ton of different types of fantasy. But you need to know, especially, that if your book is magical, it's most likely fantasy. So that when you are querying, you can say with confidence, this is fantasy. You do not have to put it into a subgenre, but you can. Okay, you can. Next, there is science fiction. Science fiction is when there are elements making the world unreal, and these are scientific elements, such as technology. Again, there are lots and lots of subgenres of science fiction. There is post-apocalyptic fiction. There is dystopian fiction. There is space opera. There is time travel fiction. There's like cyberpunk and steampunk and eco something. I don't know, eco thriller or something like that. I don't know. There's just a ton. So, but you need to know it is scientific. It has to do with science, and it has to do with like technical stuff. You may need to know two specific distinctions. So in fantasy, we talked about how you might want to know like high fantasy, epic fantasy. So you might want to know if your fantasy is high fantasy or more of like a low fantasy, contemporary fantasy, historical fantasy, etc. In sci-fi, you may want to know these two distinctions: hard sci-fi versus soft sci-fi. And these kind of correlate to the high fantasy versus low fantasy kind of thing. Hard sci-fi is very sciencey. There's just a lot of, there's just a lot of science being mentioned, if that makes sense. There's a lot of like technological stuff and etc. And soft sci-fi, it has the sciencey stuff, but that's not like, in order to understand the story, you don't have to like be a scientist, you know? Not that you'd have to be a scientist in hard sci-fi, but the focus is more on other things, even though you know that it's sci-fi. The focus is somewhat on other things. Okay, so hard and soft sci-fi, two things you might want to know. Then we're going to go to horror. Horror, I mentioned in my last video how horror is distinct from a thriller. One of the main ways for this is that there are really no rules in terms of suspension of disbelief of horror. You could have ghosts, you could have, for some reason I want to say pirates. That's random because you could have pirates in a lot of different types of novels, right? But you could have ghost pirates, you could have ghouls and goblins and all these kinds of things. It's not realistic is kind of the point. Like, it doesn't have to be realistic. Some people would say that if a book is really, really scary, that makes it horror. I don't think so. I think generally it is horror if it's speculative and it's like gonna be thriller otherwise. And finally, magical realism. Magical realism is very, very misunderstood. Okay, and again, this is gonna come back to the question of contemporary fantasy versus magical realism. Magical realism is something that takes place in a world based on the real world, but there is an element of magic added in. But everyone in a magical realism novel acts like the magic is just life. That's just how it is, you know. Well, a lot of times. There are some times where there's a magical person in magical realism and the person is hidden away from everyone else because, oh, we don't want anyone to know about the magic and the magic is weird. But even if the magic is considered weird in that world, it's not nearly as weird as it would be in the real world, right? So it's like, oh, you have the ability to tell people's feelings by touching them. That's weird. But in our world, that would be like, that's impossible. You know, so it's a little bit different. A lot of times magical realism goes with these like, it has, you know, it's somewhat character driven and there are these like writing styles. A lot of times it has this kind of somewhat whimsical writing style, if that makes sense. But yeah, magical realism, as I've said this like twice and I haven't come back to it, the difference between magical realism and contemporary fantasy. So contemporary fantasy takes place in something like the real world, but with some magic. However, the magic in contemporary fantasy kind of takes over things in terms of like plot, and you can't just like go on with your life and be like, oh look, there's a portal to 1947. Like, so that's contemporary fantasy because you're starting off in the real world and then you're like, oh look, there's a portal to 1947. Like, you can't really act like everything's normal. It's not. Whereas in magical realism, people kind of are going on with their lives in spite of this magic happening. There's so many debates about the differences between these two things, and it's tough. Okay, magical realism also, it could be historical, like it could be historical magical realism, so it doesn't have to take place now. But yeah, there's just like so much, and I feel like it's really hard to explain. But yeah, contemporary fantasy, the magic is sort of more big and more, the magic really makes itself known. It is very much something that kind of controls or influences the plot. In magical realism, it could be very much character driven. The magic is there, it does exist, but you know, I don't want to say it could just not be there, but it's a little bit different in the way that it affects the plot just because it is kind of so accepted as normal, and the magic itself tries to be quiet and unassuming, even though, oh no, some mishap could happen and, you know, we could all kind of fall into the, I don't know, like, we could all kind of fall into the trap of, oh no, this magic created some problems, and etc. So, I hope that that explanation makes sense. If not, I may have to make a video on that specific distinction, and kind of try and go into examples. But yeah, for now, I hope I've given you the basics of speculative fiction. If your book is speculative fiction, that is something you want to mention. So if it's sci-fi and it's a thriller, I mentioned this in the last video. If it's a sci-fi thriller, you might not mention it being a thriller, but you definitely want to mention it being sci-fi. So any category of speculative fiction into which your book falls, that is something you want to mention. If it is romance, you have to mention that the book is romance. So what you'll do is you'll put one of these speculative fiction distinctions in front of the word romance. So if it is a sci-fi romance, you're going to say sci-fi romance, or you might go into the specific type of sci-fi, etc. But you definitely want to mention the speculative element when classifying the book. Okay, so thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.